Alrighty, so the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and style our header and our navigation. So let's hop back over into our project. Again, I do have an HTTP server running against this directory, and as you can see right here. And I do have a command line window open where I can just hit the up arrow and hit enter to, whoops, I didn't mean to add that slash in there, to execute the less compiler. So let's go ahead and style our header. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into our styles header.less, and I'm going to delete that style out of there because we don't need it. It was just there for example purposes. And I'm going to declare two variables, but I'm going to do something really fun with them. I'm going to go ahead and say header background, but I'm not going to give it a straight up value. Instead, I'm going to say Lighten background 5%. And then I'm going to say header-border is darken background by 5%. So what is going on here? Well, here I'm using these functions. So let's see what these functions do. Obviously, if I go out and I compile this right now, we're not going to see the result of executing these functions because we're just assigning them to a variable that will be parsed out. So let's actually use these variables real fast. I'm going to open up a selector that's going to be site-wrap.header. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a background of header background, and I'm going to give it a border bottom of 2px solid header border. I'm going to hit Control S to save this file. Always make sure to save your file before compiling. And then I'm going to hop back over here, and I'm going to npm run styles. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and see what this looks like first. I'm going to hit refresh over here, and we see that we have this kind of lighter background here and this darker border right here. So that's really cool. So let's go ahead and see what happened to our CSS file, our compiled CSS file. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to collapse our Solution Explorer so we have some more screen space. And now I'm going to scroll down. Whoops, I didn't mean to do site.less. I meant to do site.css. Derp. Okay, so now what we have down here is the rule that we declared in our header.less file. And you notice its background has been set to these particular colors. And that's because what happened was I ran them through these functions. Less has a bunch of these functions that you can use in order to base values off of other things. So if I came to my site.less, for example, and I changed the value of background, my header background would change accordingly by lightening up whatever I declared background to be. So it's a very, very, very useful feature of less. So in this case, I'm saying lighten this color by 5%, or darken this color by 5%. Darken obviously does the opposite of lighten. Now, you can find out more about all the different functions you can use in less. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them. I use lighten and darken a lot. I also use some functions that make colors more or less transparent. But if you want to learn more about them, of course, the documentation is going to be great for that. So if you head over to lesscss.org and jump over to the function reference, you get a nice listing of all the different awesome functions that you can use. Everything from math functions to string functions to color functions, whatever you might want to do to create really flexible styles where you can base like the entire theme of a website off one color, and then if you change that color, it'll change everywhere, but even if some of those colors might be more transparent or less transparent or darker, lighter, whatever. So anyway, yeah, definitely check that out if you are interested in that. So let's go ahead and move on and style our H1 and our strong tag. So I'm going to come up here to site wrap header, and I'm going to create a selector for H1. And I'm going to go ahead and do font weight, normal, just throwing in some average, just general styles, nothing really that interesting. We'll do a padding of 10px 0, which will give it the padding top and bottom of 10px and a padding left and right of 0. And we'll go ahead and give its font size to 20 pixels. And then inside of H1, I want to style that strong tag. And for the strong tag, I'm just going to give it a straight up color, FF. 7B00, nice little orange color. Of course, we could go out and turn this into a variable if we wanted to. I'm going to give it a font weight of normal, override that, and then I'm going to give it a font size of 14px. So now that we have that, I'm just going to start doing this off screen, but I'll tell you every time I'm doing it. I'm going to go ahead and recompile our CSS file. And as you see, I successfully did that because our site.css updated with the new compilation, where we now have actual CSS that a browser will understand. Coming back here and hitting F5, we now see that our nice little header is now properly styled. Before we move on, I'm going to introduce an incredibly important concept that will be appropriate for not only doing less or Sass, but it'll also be appropriate when doing things like TypeScript or CoffeeScript or ECMAScript 6 or what have you. Now, we have a major problem with the way that we've been doing this, besides not using Gulp, of course, but more than that, our Chrome, our browser developer tools are going to be useless in helping us track down where styles are. I'm sure you guys are aware of your browser's development tools, and if you aren't, I highly encourage you to take a look at them and explore them. But I'm going to open them up here, and because we're low on screen space, I'm going to dock this guy to the bottom here, and maybe get rid of the console. If I come here and I go ahead and select this website, let's say, for example, I want to know what file that or what line of code resulted in that website being orange. Let's say, you know, I think that orange is just awful and completely ruins the entire website, and I really want to track down what line and what file happens so I could do a git blame on them and track down whoever did that. What you would normally do is you would normally do what I just did. You would right-click it, hit inspect, or you would use your little inspector, select the element in the DOM, and then look over to your style panel and see, okay, so this color comes from this rule right here. So let's look at the file. But we have a problem here. The file that Chrome is saying that this style is coming from is site.css line 37. If I click on that, what I'm going to get is the compiled CSS file. Now, this is very, very, very problematic because like I said, when you're actually writing less in a production environment, you're going to be having a lot of imports where you write modular CSS, and you really want to know exactly where that line is. Now, there's a very, very easy way to fix this, and that is using what are called source maps. Now, source maps are specially they're basically just specially created bits of data that describe to a browser where compiled code came from and what file that compiled code came from. So source maps are going to be incredibly important, and whenever you work with a less or Sass or ECMAScript 6, always be sure to use them in development. They're not necessary for production if you don't want to. So to do this, we need to do a different command. We need to tell the less compiler we want to generate source maps. So how do we do that? Well, we could look at the documentation, or we could go ahead and poke around a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say node modules.bin less C. I'm going to hit enter. And by not specifying any parameters, it's going to give us a nice list of all the awesome parameters that that this command accepts. And the ones that I'm most worried about or concerned about here are these source maps, guys. Now, with source maps, you can do one of two things. You can have an external source map, where the source map is this little file that gets served alongside your compiled CSS file, or you could do source maps inline. I generally prefer to keep my source maps inline. So what I would want to do is I would want to say source map inline to put the source map into the actual compiled CSS file itself. So let's go ahead and modify our package.json file to tell the less compiler that I want it to create source maps. So jumping into package.json, and looking at my scripts here, all I need to do is say less c, but then before specifying site.less and site.css, simply say --, and then provide source-map.map-inline. All right. Now that I've done that, I can come back here and I can type in npm. Oops, I should probably leave that on the screen for you guys. Npm run styles and hit enter. And now that I've ran that code, I can come back here to my site.css and notice at the bottom, there's a base 64 encoded source map. So all this little gibberish right here is going to instruct the browser where each one of these lines of code came from within our application, what less files they came from. All right, so take a look at that if you're still typing that out or interested, because I'm about to close package.json. So we'll go ahead and close that. I'll jump back over into, let's do header.less over here. And then I'm going to collapse this, come back here to my example website and refresh. Now, if I come in here and inspect this website, notice right now on the right-hand side here, it says header.less at line 4. So now I can actually go and locate header.less and track down exactly what line of code is responsible for this rule. And if I click on it, what's really cool is Chrome will actually detect if you're working on the local file system and actually load up these less files for you if they exist. So I can actually take a look at this less file right inside of Chrome if I wanted to. Now, if you wanted to get a little crazy, there are a couple source map visualizer tools you can use. So one of them, you can find this just by Googling source map visualization, but you can see the URL at the top. I can come in here and I can click on custom and hit choose file, and I'm going to choose the compiled file, site.css, and that's going to ask me for the original file, site.less, so I'll grab that, and that's going to also ask me for the header.less file, and I can go ahead and upload that as well. And then I don't have to hit load, but now I can see on the left-hand side my source code, and on the right-hand side my compiled source code. So you'll see, for example, if for example, right here, this body, because this body is generated from these multiple body selectors are generated from this nested selector right here, this nested rule. We see that this single word body multiple times relates to just this one line of code. So you can come in here and you can kind of see how the source map is working. Maybe something is misbehaving a little bit. You can use this to diagnose them. But anyway, that's enough about source maps. They're very, very easy to use. Your browser's going to support them, and they pretty much, to generate a source map is basically just passing in a parameter to whatever compiler you're using. Any transpiler of anything, be it JavaScript to JavaScript or TypeScript to JavaScript or less to CSS, is going to support using source maps. All right, so there's not a whole lot more to talk about. The one big thing to talk about is going to be Mixins. So you can say a lot about Mixins. There's a lot of really cool things about Mixins. I suggest if you want to do more advanced Mixins than what we're going to show here, head over to the documentation. But let me go ahead and show you guys just the spirit of Mixins. Now, let's say to do this, I'm going to start off by just typing out some more just straight up less. And then I'll show you guys an example of somewhere that you might want to use a mixin. So let's go ahead and style our nav. For the nav, I'm going to give it a display of flex. Then I'm going to select immediate descendants of the A tag. And my anchor tags, I'm going to give them a display of block, padding all around of 10 pixels, a color of EEE, a light gray color, a text align of center, text generation of none. I'm going to give this a flex basis of 0 and a flex row of 1. We'll see how this is used in a second here. If you're not familiar with Flexbox, I recommend checking it out, but this will give you guys a nice little feel of how you can use Flexbox anyway. Then I'm going to say, I'm going to open up a nested selector, but I want to select the anchor tag that has the selected class on it that's nested within this nav. So notice how that right now I have my A tag selected, but I want one of these guys to be considered selected so that I give them a different style. So over here in home, I'm going to add a class of selected. And then to select that within a nested rule, I use the ampersand, then dot selected. The ampersand is like taking, it would be the same thing, so this is one way to do it. It would be the same thing as doing this. And I did not mean to hit Control W. I don't know why I did. Okay, so what we can do here with our header, which I did not load because I'm blind. What we did here is these two things do the same thing. This ampersand basically appends whatever additional selector we put onto the parent rule, or the parent selector of the parent rule. So basically, this code right here, this rule right here, is going to match this one anchor tag. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say a background of what was that that nice little accent color I used in our site.less. I believe I called that color accent. And so I'm going to use that variable. So I'm going to use my accent variable for that. I'm going to give it a color of white and a cursor of default. And then I'm going to do another thing. I'm going to say if you hover over the selected element, so I'm doing another nested rule here. We'll take a look at how this compiles into CSS here in a moment. I'm going to say background is going to be color accent. Then underneath ampersand selected, I'm going to do another ampersand hover. So this hover rule will only apply to all of the anchor tags when they're being hovered over, whereas this hover rule will only be applied to anchor tags that have the selected class on them. And I'll just do background is Let's go ahead and do the color accent here, just to keep things simple, with the color of FFF for white. So now I'm going to go ahead and compile this. And before I show you the CSS, let's see what it looks like. So now we have equally spaced elements here. And we have our hover, and we have our home being selected. We know it's selected because it has that accent color, and also our cursor is set to default. So let's look at the CSS for that. If I jump over here and look at site.css, notice how we have the a.selected, which is this guy right here. We have a.selected hover with the pseudo-element hover, or pseudo-class hover, with this background of color accent. And then we have the straight-up normal hover right here. So you can immediately see how this hierarchy really makes it simple to write these very nested selectors. And so we don't have to repeat ourselves all the time. And the ampersand is really, really important, because if I didn't have this ampersand here, on this guy right here, what would happen is it would be a space selected, as opposed to just a dot selected, which has different meaning in CSS. The last thing I want to do is, when it comes to the layout of this, is I want to go ahead and I want the navigation to be left aligned. I want all of the navigation elements to have the same width, but I want it to only take up half of the width of the header. To do that, I'm going to take advantage of a pseudo element directly on our nav element. So underneath our A tag right here. So you can see when I click on this, it selects the curly braces. Underneath that, I'm going to do ampersand after to select the after pseudo element. I'm going to give it a content of empty string so that it renders, and then I'm going to give it a flex grow of 5. So what this means is our A elements will grow as a flex grow of 1, whereas our after will be 5 times bigger. And because there's 4 elements, now there's 5 with the pseudo element, that'll take up half the space. So let me go ahead and recompile. Oops, I did not mean to do that. Come over here and rerun, and now we see that our nav is taking up half the space of this, but it's left aligned here, and each element has the same width. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about are mixins. So what are mixins? Mixins are a way for us to reuse CSS or less code within our application. So let's go ahead and define a couple mixins. I want to create a couple mixins that makes working with borders easier on my selected anchor tag. So I'm going to jump into mixins. How do we define a mixin? Well, it's very, very straightforward. All we do is create a element, a rule that has a class selector, and I'm going to call it something. I'm going to call it top radius. And then you have to open up parentheses. Now, the parentheses are like function parameters. In fact, they are parameters. They behave in the exact same way that parameters would work in any language. So in this case, I'm going to take in a parameter of radius. And the top radius is simply going to say border top left radius is equal to radius, and border top right radius is radius. So this defines a simple mixin. Now, whenever I invoke this mixin, I'll have to provide this parameter, and then these rules will be printed out wherever I invoke that mixin. So how do I do that? Let's go ahead and open up my site.css and my header.css and my mixins.less at the same time. And coming down here to selected, what I want to do is I want to say dot top radius, and then I'm going to pass in 5 pixels. So now I'm invoking this mixin. Now remember, mixins.less is included before header.less, so we can take advantage of this mixin. You always want to define your mixins first. So now that we're invoking this mixin, I'll go ahead and compile. And on the right-hand side, we'll see that the mixin did indeed get implied. It got executed, and its rules got inserted into this A tag, or this anchor tag. So coming back here and hitting F5, you notice we now have rounded corners on the top left and top right of our selected element. All right, there's a couple other ways to use mixins, but it looks like we are running out of time. So we will see you in the next video, and we'll wrap up our discussion on less. And see you then.